I was not born beside the river, but I became myself there. I learned its moods the way some people learn a lover's breathing. How the surface lies to you when the current underneath is hungry. How the foam collects in eddies like secrets that can't find a mouth. How the reeds bend in warning before you hear the roar that means something upstream has snapped. The old people said the river had a memory. I didn't understand that until the night it remembered my husband before I could, and pulled him from my arms like a name. I was too slow to speak. They said it was an accident. They said the rope slipped. The boat lurched. The storm was larger than anyone's life, but I was there. I was there when the sky came down in sheets and the bank broke loose in black slabs. When the cold reached into my bones and found the place where my breath belonged and took it the way a thief takes the only ring you wear every day. I was there when he shouted my name and I shouted his, and the river decided it would only keep one of us. I felt his fingers in mine, then the jolt when the current caught his legs and my nails caught skin, and then nothing. Just the shape of his hand leaving and the sound the world makes when the person who knows your voice goes under. Everyone told me no one could have held him in that water. I don't care. Guilt is heavier than any body, and I have carried both after that night. The village became a chorus that could not sing my name without shame. Poor thing, they said at first, and then, when the weeks hardened and my belly began to show and I would not bow to the arrangements brought to my door, their pity turned to something sharper. It's not right, they said, as if I was the storm and not the woman who had lived through it, a widow with no man and a child on the way. I learned the difference between silence and being silenced. I learned how doors can be closed gently enough to look like weather. I could have left, I suppose. That's what a sensible person might say now, in a dry room with clean windows and a cup that keeps its heat. But grief is a magnet and the river was iron. I could not abandon the last place his face existed in motion. When I closed my eyes, I saw him halfway between the surface and the dark. And in that impossible second, everything else went still as the world chose. To leave the river would have been to choose, and I was not ready to choose a life that did not contain him, even if that life was made of water and hunger, and the kind of cold that makes your bones spell your name wrong. So I went back to the bank, where the willow leans like an old woman listening, and I built a shelter with my hands and the pieces no one else wanted. Driftwood, rusted tin, rope that had given up holding on to anything heavier than rain. I packed the floor with reeds and spread an old blanket like a memory you promise not to wash. I made a small ring of stones in the bare dirt where I would coax flame from damp kindling with the patience of a prayer. The smoke smelled like wet promises. I hung his coat on a nail so I would have a shape to talk to when the nights remembered my mouth. During the day, I pretended at work. I gathered deadfall the river left like regret. I cut reeds to weave into mats I could not sell because I would not climb the path to the market square where the women stood in a row with baskets that looked like they had never been empty. The path is steep. My breath would not forgive me the climb, and neither would the eyes I would have to pass. I learned the river's schedule the way I learned my husband's when it was safe to wash at the bend, when the stones near the split were slick with algae and wearing the green silence that makes ankles vanish, when the fish flashed like silver punctuation in the shadow where the bank cuts in. Sometimes I caught one with hands that shook with a hunger that wasn't only the body's. I would roast it on a stick, and eat slowly, pretending I was at a table where someone would say, "Leave the head for me," and reach across my plate the way he used to, grinning at a rule he had no intention of learning. At night, the river spoke. People who have never slept next to moving water think it always says the same thing. It doesn't. Some nights it was a story about the mountain and the patience of rain. Some nights it was a confession made to stones that didn't have the decency to keep it. Some nights it was a list of everything it would take if given the chance. On those nights, the baby inside me would press against my ribs as if to argue. I'd lay my hand there, feeling the small insistence of a person I had not yet seen claim me with a foot. It is a strange miracle to feel the future before it has a face. I would tell the river, "You cannot have this one," and the reeds would tick their little green clocks, as if to say, time would make that bargain or refuse it, without asking me. I don't know when the visions began, because grief and exhaustion will paint pictures on the inside of your skull so carefully. You think the world has agreed to your illusion. I would wake certain I heard his boots on the stones. The particular rhythm of a man who has carried more than wood and learned not to complain. I would say his name and the night would say it back from the other side of the willow, softer. And I would sit with that echo the way you sit with a stranger who knows the lyrics and not the tune. Some nights I dreamed of the river letting him go, spitting him back like a bone it did not want to swallow, and we would be at the door with the crooked hinge and he would be laughing because once you have learned you can survive anything. Laughter is a rebellion you earn. I would wake with my face wet and my palms clenched into a shape that couldn't hold water. There were good days too. That is the part people who love tragedy will tell you they cannot bear the intrusions of ordinary joy. A shaft of sun that finds your back and makes the skin there remember heat. A heron lifting from the shallows. A gray man with an old mission, legs trailing lace. The day I found a row of tiny paw prints in the mud and followed them to discover a fox asleep in a nest of reeds, curled like a question that had decided it was good enough to be a fact. I stood very still and watched the ribs rise and fall under that rusty coat and thought, even here, the body chooses rest. One did not move until it did, and when it lifted its head and looked at me, I nodded like we were two souls that had made the same map and lost it in the same weather. If this sounds like I am avoiding the truth, it is only because the truth is easier to tell when your hands are busy. The truth is that I was abandoned twice, once by water, once by the living. The first made me hollow. The second tried to make me invisible. The first I could not forgive. The second I refused to accept. It is a peculiar power to say, "You will not erase me," and then set about surviving in a place that writes in flood and edits in drought. There were days when the ache behind my sternum was a stone I could not lift. There were days when the child rolled inside me and I felt like a country, newly mapped and already invaded. And there were days when I understood that love is what we call the discipline of staying when everything else has learned to leave. The first sign of winter was not snow, it was silence. The river lowers its voice when the cold arrives, as if it is making room for the air to have its say. The reeds turned the color of bread and brittle enough to think like old women. I mended the roof with more tin, more rope, more stubbornness. My fingers cracked and bled and healed as if they were practicing a story I was too tired to tell. I began to count wood as time. I began to count kicks as prayers. I moved closer to the willow because in winter you want your back against something that remembers the ground. One evening, late, when the light had gone, that blue which belongs to promises and lies, I heard footsteps on the path that comes from the old bridge. The village had washed its hands of me, but there are always those who like to test their cleanliness at night. I took the knife I kept under the blanket and tucked it into my sleeve because even if I never had to use it, courage is a tool. Like anything else, you feel better when you know where it is. A man stepped into the circle of my firelight and stopped. He was thinner than his coat wanted to admit. He had the gait of someone who has learned to walk without being heard. His face was the color of travel, and the accent on his good evening was the kind that puts borders in a sentence whether you invite them or not. He kept his hands where I could see them, which is to say he had been in rooms where that courtesy had been forgotten. "I'm lost," he said, and the lie was kind. Lost men do not carry themselves like people who know the names of their ghosts. You and everyone else. I said, because grief makes the mouth cruel and the heart sensible. He smiled like a man who had not been given the correct answer on purpose before. "I heard there was a village," he said. "I missed it." "You didn't," I answered. "It missed you." We stood inside the small agreement of fire and wind and the sound of water pretending to sleep. Up close, I saw the scar along his jaw and the doctor's bag at his feet. The leather gone soft in the corners from being opened and closed in a hurry. My pulse did something that was not fear. It was the feeling you get when the river drops a log at your door that fits exactly the gap you were too proud to admit was there. "May I sit?" he asked, and I shrugged, because power is the gentlest, yes, when you have none to spare. He sat. He did not ask me why I lived here alone, why my belly rose like a question to which all the answers are work. He knew better. As the fire tuned itself to the night, he took from his coat a small loaf wrapped in cloth and a wedge of cheese and placed both between us without looking at me. I did not move for a long breath, because hunger and dignity use the same spine to stand. Then I ate. He pretended not to notice my hands. I pretended not to notice his patience. He told me he was passing through. That the war had made doctors into travelers and travelers into numbers and numbers into stories no one would claim. He told me he had learned to sleep sitting up and to listen with his fingertips because ears can be lied to. He told me he would leave in the morning and that he was grateful for a place where the water made sense even when people didn't. I told him nothing he did not need to know, which is to say I said my name and his went quiet around it like a man standing in a doorway that isn't his. When the fire sank to coals and the cold rearranged itself around our small red planet, the baby kicked twice, hard. A drum in a parade that had forgotten the route. I pressed my hand there and closed my eyes. Without asking, the man reached into his bag and brought out a stethoscope, dented at the rim and warm from his pocket. He held it toward me and did not touch me until I moved my own hands to allow it. The metal found my skin. He leaned in, his head tilted, That stillness doctors learn when they are listening to fear with their face. Then he smiled a small, tired miracle. Strom, he said, as if my heart had been the question and not the child's eye. Slept that night because a stranger's kindness can do what the river cannot. It can return you to yourself without asking a price you cannot pay. In the morning, he was gone, but the fire was stacked and there was a clean line of footprints that led to the bridge, and then became a rumor in the frost. Loneliness returned, but it did not sit where it had before. It had to share the blanket with something I will not flatter as hope. Hope is a house. I was not ready to unlock the door, but there was room now for a chair where someone might one day sit and say nothing with me. And that is its own architecture. Winter closed its fist. The river quieted to a muscle under ice. The sky learned how to carry a color I did not know the name of. I counted the days by the length of the shadows on the rocks and the way my breath fogged the air at noon. And then, one deep night when the cold sounded like glass and the stars hung like nails, I woke with a pain that began as a whisper and folded itself into a command. The child was ready to be born, and the river that had taken everything lifted its head to listen. I gathered the cloths I had saved for clean and the cord I had braided in the way my mother taught me when I was still speaking to women whose hands knew more than mine. I built the fire high and fast until the tin roof clicked its approval. I knelt by the reed mat with my back to the willow and my face to the dark. And I breathed the way you breathe when you are telling the truth to a God who has learned not to interrupt. Pain was a tide. Between its waves, I saw my husband's face not as it was when the river kept it, but as it was the first time he called me by the name I had not known belonged to me until he said it. Stay, I whispered to a man who was gone and to a child who was arriving. Stay anyway. The wind rose and the willow answered, and the ice on the far bank sang that thin, impossible hymn only winter knows. The contractions gathered themselves into work. I did not cry out because there was no one to bring and no one to send away. When the moment split me like the world had, I leaned forward, put my hands where life would be, and met what came with everything I had left. At first, there was only heat, and the rush of blood in my ears, and the old, animal wordless shock of a body remembering it was built for this. Then there was a slippery weight in my palms, and the rough, beautiful indignity of a cry that had not yet learned speech. And around us, as if the valley had been holding its breath for months, waiting for this sound, the river found its voice again and carried the infant's wail outward and upward, until it touched rock and pine and the empty windows of houses where people were sleeping through their own stories. The baby's cry echoed, and in the echo I heard an answer I could not have imagined when the water took my husband. I heard the valley say our names back to us, all three, as if it had decided to keep us this time. When morning came, it felt as if the entire valley was holding its breath. Mist drifted low over the river, turning everything into soft shades of gray and gold. The frost still clung to the reeds, glittering faintly like the remnants of a dream that didn't want to end. And there, in the circle of my arms, was my child, red-faced, warm-breathing, proof that something good could still begin in a place where everything else had ended. I named him Jonas. After the man the river took. It wasn't sentiment, it was defiance, because I wanted the name to live somewhere again, not underwater, not in whispers, but here, in the light. His cry had stopped hours ago, replaced by the steady rhythm of tiny breaths. It was strange how that sound so small, so fragile could fill an entire world that had once been empty. I wrapped him tighter in the last clean blanket I owned and pressed my lips to his forehead. He smelled like smoke and milk and salvation. My body trembled, still raw from the storm of birth, but I forced myself to move. We couldn't stay in the open. Not now that the world had started watching again. I cleaned the mat, washed what I could in the freezing water, and built a new fire. The pain between my hips pulsed like memory, but I ignored it. There's no such thing as rest when you're the only witness to your own miracle. I melted snow in an old tin cup, dipped a cloth, and cleaned the baby's tiny hands. He clenched one finger around mine like a promise. The wind shifted around noon. It carried voices. They came from the path above the bend. Distant, confused, human. My heart stuttered. No one had walked that way in months. I wrapped Jonas close against me, covering his head with the blanket, and stepped behind the willow. From there, I could see the narrow trail where two figures appeared, men in heavy coats, rifles slung over their shoulders. Hunters, perhaps, or worse, soldiers. The border wasn't far, and war had a way of spilling into every crack of peace. I stayed still. My pulse thudded so loud it could have given us away. They paused near the fire pit smoke, scanning the bank. Tracks, one said. Small ones. A woman, maybe. They followed the prints until they reached the willow. My whole body went rigid. Jonas stirred, gave a soft whimper. I pressed my palm over his back, whispering a prayer that didn't have words. But instead of calling out, the men exchanged a look, shrugged, and moved on down the river, their voices fading into the wind. When they were gone, I sat down hard in the snow, shaking from relief. I knew the truth. It wasn't just luck. The river had hidden me, as if returning a favor. The same current that once stole everything now guarded the little we had left. I didn't know whether to thank it or fear it. Days passed. The storms lessened. Jonas slept through most of them, his cheeks pink with the heat of my body against his. I survived on roots and fish. The same routine that had kept me alive before him, but now it felt different. I wasn't eating to stay alive, I was eating to stay strong enough for him. Motherhood doesn't come with an instruction, only an instinct. And mine told me that this valley, though cruel, would not let me die yet. Then, one evening, I saw smoke, not from my fire, from higher up, near the old bridge. It rose in slow, straight ribbons, white against the violet dusk. At first, I thought it was the doctor, the man who had appeared and vanished like a ghost. I wanted it to be him. I wanted someone to know that I had survived. So I waited until Jonas was asleep, swaddled near the fire, and I climbed partway up the path. My legs trembled. The air bit into my throat, but when I reached the ridge, I stopped dead. It wasn't one fire, it was three, and beside them, tense men in uniform were gathered around a cart. I saw the gleam of metal, heard the low murmur of orders being given. Refugees, perhaps, or patrols. It didn't matter which. Both meant danger for a woman with no home, no papers, and a newborn. I turned back, clutching my shawl tighter around me. That night I didn't sleep. I listened to every creak of the branches, every rustle outside. The forest has a language of its own, and I had learned most of its words. But sometime near dawn, the air changed again, heavy, electric. A storm was building, and the river's voice rose in anticipation. The storm broke by midday. Thunder rolled across the valley like a drumbeat, shaking snow from the trees. Jonas whimpered against my chest, startled by the noise. I sang to him, not a lullaby, just fragments of a hymn I half remembered from childhood. Peace, be still, I whispered. Peace, be still. He quieted. For the first time in months, I felt something close to safety, but it didn't last long. Because just as the rain began to fall, someone called my name. Mara. The sound sliced through the storm, rough, male, desperate. It came from the direction of the path. For a heartbeat, I froze. No one should have known my name. No one but him. But when I turned, the figure that stumbled down the hill was not Jonas, it was the doctor. He looked half-dead, soaked. Mud splattered, a gash across his brow. But when his eyes found me under the willow, they widened with something like disbelief. "You're alive," he said, voice breaking. I thought he staggered forward, dropping to one knee near the fire. They said a woman had died giving birth by the river. I followed the smoke, but I was too late. "I didn't die," I said quietly, shifting Jonas so he could see. He wouldn't let me. The doctor's eyes softened when they landed on the child. He reached out as if to touch, then hesitated. "He's strong," he murmured, just like his mother. He looked older now, thinner. His hands trembled when he tried to open his bag. "I had to leave the camp," he said. "They found out I was helping refugees. There's nowhere safe now, but there's a train that still runs through the border at dawn tomorrow. I can take you." I stared at him, unsure if I was hearing right. Leave the river, the valley, the place where everything had happened. The thought of stepping onto ground that didn't remember my husband's name made my chest tighten. "I can't," I whispered. He looked at me, rain dripping from his lashes. "You'll die if you stay." "I already did," I said. The storm raged on, but he didn't leave. He patched the holes in my roof, built the fire higher, cooked roots and fish for me while I nursed Jonas. He didn't ask questions, not about my past, not about the things I still whispered to the river when I thought he was asleep. He worked silently, his every motion gentle, deliberate. Sometimes, in the flicker of the flames, I saw the man my husband might have become if the river had spared him, patient, tender, carrying his wounds like proof instead of shame. When night fell, we sat in silence, the storm still hammering the world outside. I wanted to thank him, to say something that mattered, but gratitude is clumsy when you've forgotten how to speak to kindness. So instead, I asked, "What's your name?" He smiled faintly. Lucas, I repeated, testing the sound. "Why did you come back?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, quietly, "Because when I left that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman who kept her fire burning beside a river that wanted her gone." Before dawn, I woke to the sound of footsteps again, not Lucas's this time. Heavy, deliberate, too many. He was already at the door, his hand on the knife he kept near the cot. "Stay inside," he whispered, through the crack in the wall. I saw lanterns moving among the trees. Soldiers, sweeping the valley. Their voices were close enough that I could hear the words refugee woman and infant. My blood turned to ice. Lucas grabbed my wrist. "They're looking for you," he said. "We have to move now." "Move where?" "The river," he said simply. "They'll never follow us there." And so, before the light came, we left the shelter that had been both prison and home. The snow was deep, the air slicing like glass. Lucas led the way, holding Jonas against his chest, while I stumbled behind, my legs weak and my breath burning. The wind howled through the valley as if protesting our escape. Behind us, the soldiers' shouts grew faint, then vanished. By the time we reached the far side of the river, the storm had cleared, leaving the world raw and bright. The sunrise bled through the clouds in streaks of red and gold, painting the snow like fire. Lucas turned, his face pale, his breath misting in the air. "We made it," he said, but even as he spoke, the ice beneath his feet groaned. The sound of cracking ice is unlike any other, sharp, hollow, final. It's the sound of trust breaking under your feet. It was the same sound I heard the night the river took Jonas, and when it came again that morning, my body remembered before my mind could. "Lucas, stop," I shouted. But it was too late. The ice beneath him split like glass under a hammer. 1 second, he was there, solid, alive. The next, he was gone. Swallowed by the black mouth of the river. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then came the roar. The violent swirl of freezing water devouring everything it touched. Lucas's coat surfaced once, then vanished under the current. The river didn't care that it had already taken one life from me. It had no mercy left to give. I didn't think. I ran. The pain in my body screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. Jonas, the baby, was strapped to my chest, wrapped tight in the last blanket. I could feel his small heart beat against my skin, frantic but alive. "Hold on," I whispered, not to him, but to Lucas. Though the wind tore the words from my mouth. When I reached the edge, I dropped to my knees and crawled toward the broken hole. The cold sliced through me like knives, but I didn't care. I reached into the water, my arms vanishing up to the elbows, my skin burning from the cold. "Lucas," I screamed, and then a hand, pale trembling, reaching up from the darkness. I grabbed it with both hands and pulled. My muscles tore, my breath vanished, but the river, stubborn as it was, gave him back inch by inch. When his face finally broke the surface, he was blue-lipped, eyes unfocused. I dragged him onto the ice, rolling him onto his back. He wasn't breathing. "No," I whispered. "No, no, not you too." I pressed my hands to his chest and pushed, again and again, counting out loud to keep from breaking. The ice beneath us groaned, but I didn't stop. Finally, he coughed a harsh wet sound that shattered the silence like a miracle. Water spilled from his lips, and I turned his head so he could breathe. "Don't move," I said, though my own voice was shaking so hard it barely sounded human. "Don't you dare die here." He smiled weakly, eyes half open. "You sound like my mother," he whispered. "Good," I said, breathless. Maybe she was right about everything too. We crawled back toward the riverbank, slow as ghosts. Every movement was pain, my body numb, my fingers useless, my skin raw from the cold. But we made it. Somehow, the river spared us both this time. When we reached solid ground, Lucas collapsed, shivering uncontrollably. I covered him with the blanket as best I could and held Jonas close between us, using my body heat to keep them both alive. The forest around us was silent now, eerily so. No birds, no wind, just the faint trickle of water beneath the ice. I could almost feel the river watching, waiting. It had become something alive to me, not evil, not kind, just ancient and patient. Always taking its toll. After what felt like hours, Lucas stirred. His lips were cracked, his skin gray, but he managed to sit up. "You saved me," he said quietly. I shook my head. "You saved us first." He gave a soft laugh that turned into a cough. "Where even then." We found an abandoned barn near the ridge, a place the hunters must have used years ago. The roof sagged, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. I built a fire in the corner while Lucas stripped off his soaked coat and rubbed his hands over the flames. Steam rose from his sleeves, and his face slowly regained color. Jonas lay between us, bundled in his blanket, sleeping peacefully. Watching him breathe was the only proof I needed that we were still in the world. "You shouldn't have followed me," I said finally, staring into the fire. Lucas looked up. "I couldn't let them find you." "Why?" He hesitated, eyes flickering to the child. Because I've seen what happens to women like you when soldiers find them. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was right. After a while, I whispered, you almost died for a stranger. You're not a stranger, he said simply. You were the first person who let me sit by their fire without asking what I'd done to deserve the cold. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps again, but not his. Soft, deliberate, outside the barn. I sat up. Every sense sharpened. Lucas was already awake, his hand near the knife. We listened. The snow outside creaked once, twice, then silence. He gestured for me to stay back, then moved to the door. When he opened it, the wind rushed in, and standing in the threshold was a child. A little girl, no older than 7. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. She held a basket in one hand and stared at us with wide, unblinking eyes. Are you the people by the river? She asked softly. I didn't know what to say. Lucas crouched down, his voice gentle. Who sent you? The man from the camp, she said. He said you needed help. My heart leaped. The camp. She nodded. He told me to bring you food. She held up the basket, and when Lucas took it, I saw his expression change. Inside were 2 loaves of bread, a bottle of milk, and a folded scrap of paper. He opened it slowly. It was a map, drawn by hand, leading to a trail marked with 3 crosses, one of them circled in red. Next to it, a message. There's a boat. Use it before dawn. They'll come again. By morning, the girl was gone, vanished the same way she appeared, leaving only small footprints leading back toward the woods. Lucas didn't question it, neither did I sometimes. Life sends messengers that don't belong entirely to this world. We followed the map as the sun began to rise. Jonas slept soundly in my arms, wrapped so tightly that even the wind couldn't reach him. The path wound along the ridge and down to the far side of the valley, where the river curved into a hidden cove. And there it was, a boat. Old but sturdy, tied to a post buried in the snow. Beside it, a man's coat hung from a branch, frozen stiff. Lucas inspected it carefully. Someone's been here recently. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it, carved into the boat's side, half hidden by ice. A name? Jonas. My breath caught. Not my baby's name, his father's. My husband's. Lucas turned to me. What is it? It's his name, I whispered. My husband's. He traced the letters with his gloved hand, brow furrowed. Then this boat wasn't meant for me. It was meant for you. We pushed the boat into the water together. The current was slow now, the ice breaking apart like glass under sunlight. Lucas steadied the hull while I climbed in, holding Jonas tight. The river looked different in daylight, less cruel, almost forgiving. As we drifted out into the open current, Lucas rowed in silence. Every stroke echoed against the cliffs like a heartbeat. Snow began to fall again, light, gentle, covering the world in quiet forgiveness. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the oars blend with the sound of Jonas's breathing. Then, from behind us, came a sound, distant, faint, but unmistakable. Gunfire. Lucas froze. They found the camp, he said. I turned to look. Smoke rose from beyond the ridge, black, thick, violent. Faster, I whispered. He rowed harder. The river surged beneath us, carrying the boat forward like it understood what was at stake. But the sound of shouting grew louder. The soldiers had reached the bank. I saw them through the trees, pointing, running. One of them raised a rifle. Get down, Lucas shouted. I threw myself over Jonas as the shot rang out. The bullet hit the side of the boat, splintering wood. Water rushed in, freezing and merciless. Lucas kept rowing, shouting over the noise. We're almost there. The bend, hold on. Another shot. The boat lurched. Lucas fell forward, a spray of blood marking the snow-dusted air. No, I screamed. Lucas. He didn't answer. His body slumped, one hand still gripping the oar. I pulled him toward me, pressed my hand to his wound. Stay with me, I begged. Please. His eyes fluttered open, dazed but aware. You have to keep going, he said weakly. For him, tears blurred my vision. I can't do this alone again. You already have, he whispered. You always could. The boat drifted faster now, the current taking control. Lucas's hand slipped from mine. His body went still. I held Jonas tighter, rocking him as the river carried us away, the boat, the dead, the living, the miracle that refused to die when the cliffs opened into the wide valley beyond. The world went quiet again. No soldiers. No sound, just the steady cry of my son echoing through the snow. And once more, the river, the cruel, relentless river. answered the boat. Drifted until it couldn't anymore. The river's current slowed as the valley widened. And the oars hung limp in the water, useless now that Lucas's hands no longer held them. His body lay across from me, still pale, and strangely peaceful, as if the river had taken pity on him and decided to let him rest at last. The world around us was silent. Snow fell like ash from a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. Jonas's small cries rose and fell against the emptiness, the only proof that life still existed here. I held him close, pressing his cheek against my neck, and whispered the same words I'd whispered to his father before the river took him. Stay. Please. Just stay. The river carried us a little farther until the boat bumped against a frozen bank. I could go no farther by water. My arms trembled as I lifted Jonas and wrapped him inside my coat. I kissed Lucas's forehead one last time, my lips meeting skin that was already cold, and whispered, "Thank you." Then I climbed out of the boat and stepped into the snow. The valley stretched endlessly before us, white fields, skeletal trees, and, in the distance, the faint shape of a cabin half buried by smoke rose faintly from its chimney. It was far, but it was there. Hope, thin as a thread, but real enough to follow. My legs were weak. Every step burned. But motherhood has its own kind of stubbornness. I walked. I stumbled. I fell once, twice, 3 times. The baby whimpered against my chest, and I sang to him to keep myself upright. The song wasn't really a song, just fragments of lullabies my mother used to hum. When the world was kinder, the valley answered back with echoes that stretched and bent, as if the mountains themselves were trying to remember the tune. Halfway there, I stopped. The air had changed. Behind me, the faint crack of a branch. I turned sharply, heart hammering. Nothing, just snow falling softly through the pines. But I could feel it, the sense that we weren't alone anymore. The same feeling I'd had the night Lucas first appeared, the same pulse that runs through your spine when you're being watched by something older than fear. I took another step forward, clutching Jonas tighter, and then, from somewhere unseen, I heard it, a howl. Long, low. A wolf's cry. At first, it was just one, then another, then several, echoing through the trees, surrounding us. My breath came fast, turning white against the air. Wolves were rare here, but hunger drives everything toward madness, beasts, men, even rivers. I turned toward the sound, ready to run, though I knew I couldn't outrun anything anymore. But the howls faded. Silence fell again, thick, absolute. When I looked back toward the cabin, I realized there was a figure in the doorway, a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me from across the white expanse. The wind caught his coat, lifting it slightly, and for a moment, I hoped it was Lucas, somehow alive, somehow walking toward me. My heart tripped over itself, believing what it wanted to. "Lucas," I shouted, but the figure didn't answer. He started walking, slow and careful, his boots sinking into the snow. As he came closer, I saw that he was older, bearded, dressed like a farmer. His eyes, when they found me, were cautious but not unkind. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "No one's lived near the river since the war." "I had nowhere else to go," I said. My voice cracked. "Please, my child, he needs warmth." The man's gaze softened. "Come, quickly." The cabin was small but solid, a refuge built from another century. The warmth of the fire hit me like a blow. He took Jonas from my arms with a gentleness that broke me. I sank to the floor, shaking, my legs unable to hold me anymore. The man's wife appeared from the next room, wrapped in a shawl. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and kind. She knelt beside me, pressing a cup of hot broth into my hands. "Drink, child," she said. "You're safe now." I wanted to believe her as I drank. I watched as she unwrapped Jonas from my coat. When she saw the baby's face, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. "By the saints," she whispered, "he looks just like who?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing at her husband. "Like our son. He died last winter. Fever took him." Her voice trembled. "He was about your age." I didn't know what to say. She kissed Jonas's forehead and murmured, "Maybe God sent him to us to remind us how to love again." That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, but the fire was steady. The couple slept in the next room, and Jonas lay beside me on a bed of furs. I listened to his breathing until it lulled me close to dreaming. But sometime after midnight, the wind changed. It carried something else, not the howl of wolves, but the murmur of water. The river, though we were miles from it now, I could hear it as clearly as if it ran beneath the floorboards. A low, endless hum, a heartbeat beneath the earth. I rose quietly and stepped to the window. Outside, The snow reflected moonlight so bright it looked like the world had been remade from silver. And there, at the edge of the field, stood Lucas. He wasn't moving. His coat, torn from the ice, clung to him like shadow. His eyes met mine through the glass. And he smiled faintly. I opened the door before I knew what I was doing. "Lucas," I whispered. The cold bit into my lungs, but I didn't care. "You're alive." He didn't answer. He just looked at me with that same tired tenderness, the kind that sees you completely, the kind that doesn't belong to the living. "Why did you come back?" I asked. The wind stirred, and his voice came, soft and distant, "To make sure you kept walking." I felt tears freeze against my skin. "You saved us," I said. He shook his head slowly. "No, Mara. You saved yourself." The wind blew harder, snow swirled between us, and when it cleared, he was gone. The night was silent again. Only the sound of the river remained faint, fading. Forgiven by dawn, the world felt lighter. The old couple woke early and fed us bread and warm milk. Jonas smiled for the first time, a small, unsteady smile that looked like sunlight breaking through cloud. The man offered me a place to stay. "This valley needs people again," he said. "The war took too much from it." I nodded. My heart ached, but not in the same way. It was a clean ache, the kind that comes from remembering love, not losing it. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt. Water ran in thin streams through the fields, whispering as it went. The first signs of spring. I worked in the garden, helped mend fences, sang to Jonas as the old woman hummed along. The valley, once empty, began to breathe again. And then one morning, as I stood outside hanging laundry, I heard something faint in the distance, a sound carried on the wind that froze me where I stood. A baby's cry. But not Jonas's. This one came from across the river. I turned, eyes wide. The river had flooded with meltwater, gleaming gold under the morning sun. And across the valley, standing on the opposite bank, was a group of travelers, refugees, moving west, children among them. One of them, a woman, raised a hand when she saw me. I waved back, tears stinging my eyes. The cry carried again, echoing between the cliffs. The valley answered with birdsong. That night, I wrote Lucas's name on a small wooden board and placed it near the riverbank where the first snowdrops had begun to grow. Beneath it, I wrote a single line. "The river that took, returned." I didn't know if it was true in the way facts are true, but it was true in the way healing is slow, silent, real. As the sun set behind the mountains, I stood there holding Jonas, the world around us turning gold. The air was full of the sounds of thawing, dripping, rushing, living. The valley remembered, the river forgave, and the cry of a child became its new song. Spring came late to the valley that year. But when it came all at once, as if the earth had finally remembered how to breathe. The snow that had blanketed everything for months melted into silver veins of water that laced through the fields. The bare trees turned green again, slowly, shyly, like a body rediscovering warmth. And the river, the same river that had taken, stolen, tested, sang louder than it ever had before. It no longer frightened me. I could stand at its edge without feeling that hollow pull in my chest. It was no longer a grave. It was a mirror. I had made a home here, not the one I had before. Not the one I thought I wanted, but one built from survival, forgiveness, and the stubborn grace of strangers. The old couple, Tomas and Elena, had become family. They never asked about my past, never questioned the silences that sometimes found me. They loved Jonas as if he were their own grandchild, and he filled their quiet house with laughter that spilled into the fields. Every morning, I would wake to the smell of bread baking and the sound of birds that had forgotten war. I would walk down to the riverbank, carrying Jonas on my hip, and watch the water shimmer in the sunlight. The scars of winter were still there, broken branches, bent fences, the faint ghost of the boat that had brought me here. But even scars have their beauty once you stop running from them, and every time I looked at Jonas, I saw both the men I had loved, the one the river had taken, and the one it had returned to me only long enough to remind me that love doesn't end, it changes form. One morning, I found something half buried in the mud near the waterline, a piece of driftwood, smoothed by the current. It was shaped almost like a cradle, curved and hollow. I brushed away the dirt and saw faint letters carved into the side. The edges were worn, but the name was still there. Lucas. I sat there for a long time, holding the wood in my lap, the river murmuring softly beside me. He had been here. Somehow, his name, like my husband's, had found its way back to the same water that had carried them both away. "Do you see this, little one?" I whispered to Jonas. "They're still here. Both of them. In the river, in the wind, in you." He cooed. his tiny fingers brushing the wood, and I felt something inside me unclench, something that had been waiting, aching, frozen. For the first time, I realized I was no longer surviving, I was living. That evening, Tomas came to me with a folded piece of paper. The post arrived from the southern town, he said. They're rebuilding near the border. There's work. You could start fresh, if you wanted. I looked at him, then at the horizon, where the last of the sunlight bled through the clouds. Thank you, I said softly, but I think my home is here now. He smiled. Then we'll make sure it stays that way. Alina joined us, carrying a small wooden cross she'd found in her attic. I thought you might want to place it by the river, she said, for all that it gave and all that it took. Together, we walked down to the bank. The air smelled of wet earth and lilac. I placed the cross near the water, beside the driftwood, and whispered both their names, Jonas and Lucas, into the wind. The current caught the sound and carried it away, not as loss, but as offering. That night, the dreams came back, but they were different now. In the dream, I was standing by the river at dusk, the sky painted in gold. Jonas stood beside me, older, maybe 6 or 7, his small hand clutching mine. Across the water, I saw them both, my husband and Lucas, standing side by side on the opposite bank, their faces peaceful, watching us. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The river between us wasn't a wall anymore. It was a bridge. When I woke, the moonlight spilled through the window, silver and clean. Jonas slept soundly beside me, his fingers curled around the corner of the blanket. For a long moment, I just watched him breathe. Every rise and fall of his chest was proof that miracles don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary life. Months passed. The valley changed with the seasons. In summer, the fields bloomed wild and full of color, yellows, purples, reds that glowed like embers in the tall grass. Children came to play near the river, and the villagers who had fled during the war began to return, drawn by the promise of peace. Houses were rebuilt, laughter returned to the air, and the silence that had haunted this place for years finally broke. One afternoon, as I hung laundry under the willow tree, a man approached the cabin. He was dressed in a soldier's uniform, but his face was kind, worn by travel. Are you Mara? He asked. I nodded, wary but calm. I am. He removed his cap, holding it over his chest. I was with the unit that found the camp that winter. There was a Dr. Lucas. He saved a lot of lives before. His voice caught, before the river took him. I swallowed. I know. He hesitated, then reached into his coat and handed me a small metal pendant, a saint's medal, bent and darkened with rust. We found this near the river months later. It was engraved with your name. My hands trembled as I took it. On the back, scratched in faint, uneven letters, was a single word: live. The soldier saluted, turned, and walked away. I stood there until his figure disappeared over the hill, the metal warm in my hand, tears slipping down my face like thawing snow. That night, I hung the medal beside the window, where the light of the fire could catch it. It swung gently, reflecting gold and silver across the walls, like river water caught in sunlight. Jonas reached for it, his eyes wide with wonder. It's a gift, I told him, from those who came before you, from those who loved enough to leave. He smiled, and in that moment, I saw everything: the pain, the loss, the forgiveness, the miracle of being alive converge into something simple and whole. Years later, when Jonas learned to walk, he would always wander toward the river. He loved the sound it made, the way it glittered in the sun. I would watch from the hill, calling after him, my heart steady now where it used to break. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, I swore I could hear laughter in the distance. 2 voices, familiar and warm, carried on the current. The river no longer took, it gave. It gave me back my faith, my strength, my child, and my name. And as Jonas grew and the valley flourished, people began to call it something new, a name that would stay long after we were gone. The Valley of the Cry. Not because of sorrow, but because once, in the darkest winter, a cry had risen from this place, not of death, but of life, and the mountains had heard, and answered. When I am old, I think, I will sit by the same riverbank and watch my son with his children. I will tell them stories of men who walked into water and didn't return, but whose love found another way home. I will teach them that loss is not the end, only another beginning written in a language of echoes. And when they ask me if I am afraid of the river, I will smile and tell them the truth. No, because once, when the world forgot me, it was the river that remembered my name.